In the winter of 1943, the fjords of northern Norway provided a lair for the last of Adolf Hitler's battle fleet. One of them was the battle cruiser Scharnhorst, named after one of Germany's greatest military heroes and a thorn in the side of the Royal Navy since 1939. As long as she remained in being, Scharnhorst posed a threat to Britain's Arctic convoys, the Allies' supply lifeline to the hard-pressed Soviet Union. On Christmas Day, 1943, Scharnhorst set sail for the last time. The prize of the Arctic convoys was to lure her into a trap set by the Royal Navy. Its High Command had received advanced warning of the Scharnhorst sortie from Britain's top-secret code-breaking centre at Bletchley Park. Even as she set sail, the fate of the Scharnhorst had been sealed. Scharnhorst's life had begun when her keel was laid on the 15th of June 1934. But the naval story in which she played a key part had begun some 70 years earlier, as the rulers of Prussia began to build up a German empire. In a war with Denmark, the Prussians quickly realized their naval inferiority and began to strengthen their fleet. The architect of German power was Prince Otto von Bismarck, whose policy was one of blood and iron. Bismarck ensured that Germany emerged as the dominant military and strategic power in Central Europe. A new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, forced Bismarck to resign in 1890. But his policy of military expansion continued. And alongside his superb army, the Kaiser, who had ambitions to rival Britain as a world power, took a particular interest in the German Navy. Under the command of Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, resources were poured into building up a major fleet, one capable of a battle in the North Sea against England. German naval building programs began to ring alarm bells in London. In 1888, an Admiralty Committee had declared that the Royal Navy must be at least equal to the naval strength of any two other countries. German naval expansion threatened to upset this two-power standard on which Britain's naval supremacy and its links with its far-flung empire depended. After the war, Germany was allowed to retain only two old pre-dreadnought battleships and some smaller ships. The Treaty of Versailles limited the German Navy to ships of no more than 10,000 tons and a maximum armament of 11-inch guns. In 1922, under the Washington Naval Treaty, all capital ships under construction were to be scrapped, with the exception of the Japanese Mutsu and US Maryland classes. The Royal Navy was allowed to build two battleships, Nelson and Rodney. Then no more could be constructed for 10 years, after which the replacement of capital ships over 20 years old would be allowed. A limit of 35,000 tons was established for all capital ships. Although the ban on the building of battleships was later extended for another 5 years, this did not deter both the French and Italian navies from launching new capital ship programs. In spite of the growing threat posed by air power, the battleship era did not seem to be over. The Royal Navy continued to guard its vital trade routes with a powerful fleet of cruisers. And it was to deal with the British cruisers in any future war, and to outrun any battleships sent after them, that the German Navy developed the Panzerschiff, or pocket battleship, built to the specifications laid down in the Treaty of Versailles. The first into service in 1933 was Deutschland, followed by Admiral Scheer and Graf Spee. All three were heavier than their treaty limit and armed with 6 11-inch guns, more than enough to deal with an enemy cruiser. At this time, the only German ship bearing the name Scharnhorst was a cruise liner. After Adolf Hitler came to power, it was used to provide German workers and servicemen with holidays as part of the Nazi Party's Strength Through Joy program. But in October 1936, another Scharnhorst slid down her launching ramp with deadlier intent. Along with her sister ship, Gneisenau, Scharnhorst was a battle cruiser with a displacement of well over 30,000 tons. Compared with the pocket battleships, Scharnhorst accommodated a third main gun turret. She looked state-of-the-art, but as her original bow shape betrayed, she was a throwback. Her origins could be traced to German plans for an unbuilt battlecruiser of the Jutland era, Mackensen. It had been intended to fit her with 6 15-inch guns, but these could not be completed in time. Her 9 11-inch guns meant that she would still have to avoid any Royal Navy battleships. The Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, Admiral Erich Raeder, mused that, if caught, the Führer's new ships would merely be able to die with dignity. The German naval build-up continued. In February 1939, the battleship Bismarck was launched, to be followed 2 months later by her sister Tirpitz. Within another 6 months, Germany was at war. Scharnhorst's first commanding officer was Captain Kurt Caesar Hoffmann. It was not long before he and his men saw action. On her first Atlantic cruise, in November 1939, Scharnhorst was accompanied by her sister ship, Gneisenau. Between the Faroe Islands and Iceland, the 2 battle cruisers intercepted the armed merchant cruiser Rawalpindi. It was an unequal contest. Rawalpindi had only 8 6-inch guns. But Rawalpindi's skipper, Captain Kennedy, decided to stand and fight. He opened fire at 10,000 yards. The 2 German ships quickly reduced Rawalpindi to a blazing hulk. Kennedy and most of his officers were killed when an 11-inch shell hit the bridge. While the Germans picked up survivors, the British cruiser Newcastle appeared, drawn by a wireless report from Kennedy before he was killed. Rather than risk a night action with as yet unseen elements of the home fleet, the German force withdrew. In April 1940, Scharnhorst was back in action in the Norwegian campaign. Masterminded by Admiral Raeder, the invasion of Norway was a daring naval gamble which involved almost the entire German surface fleet. The 5-pronged attack was launched on the 7th of April. Oslo, the Norwegian capital, was quickly secured. German ground forces thrust north and west, while above them the skies were dominated by the Luftwaffe. British and French troops who had been landed to support the Norwegian army were eventually forced to withdraw. Harried all the way by the Luftwaffe's dive bombers. The Germans now attempted to cut off the Allied naval evacuation, and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau lay in wait for an Allied troop convoy. Instead, they found the British carrier Glorious. The carrier's commander mistakenly assumed that Glorious was in no danger. As a consequence, he was not flying reconnaissance patrols. But unknown to him, the Admiralty had received a warning from the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, home of the Ultra Interception and Decoding Service. Ultra was the top-secret British code word for the messages encrypted on the German Armed Services Enigma machines. The Enigma machine resembled a typewriter, but one with a difference. The pressing of a key worked an internal system of rotors, which, depending on the settings, gave each letter input an alternative letter which would not logically be repeated for up to 150 million depressions. The Germans believed that Enigma was unbreakable, unaware that at Bletchley Park, British codebreakers were unlocking its secrets. However, in the spring of 1940, the codebreakers in Bletchley's expanding collection of wooden huts were still feeling their way into the Enigma maze. Nevertheless, at the beginning of June, analysis of intercepted Enigma traffic transmitted in Morse indicated that large German naval units were leaving the Baltic. The information was passed to the Admiralty, but was ignored. Glorious and her escorts were sitting ducks for the 11-inch guns of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Desperately, the destroyers tried to swathe the carrier in a smokescreen. But the pocket battleships had the range and the bearing. The 11-inch guns did the rest. In the engagement, one of the destroyers scored a torpedo hit on Scharnhorst. It was not until the end of December 1940 that she and Gneisenau left Kiel to wage war on British merchant shipping, the task for which they had been built. Their first operation was aborted after the pocket battleships had been battered in a heavy storm and were ordered back to port. Three weeks later, under the overall command of Admiral Gunther Lutyens, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau successfully broke out into the North Atlantic. They turned away from the first convoy they sighted, as it was protected by the Royal Navy battleship Ramillies. 2 weeks later, and 500 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau sank 5 ships in a scattered returning convoy. On the face of it, the pursuit of defenseless merchantmen seems ruthless, even brutal. But the commanders of the battle cruisers were careful to observe the long-established code governing operations against unarmed and unescorted merchant shipping, the so-called cruiser rules. The captured merchant seamen were fairly treated and transferred to supply ships. For the survivors, the experience was harrowing enough, and likely to be repeated at the less forgiving hands of a U-boat on a subsequent voyage. By early March, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had sailed south to the warmer waters off the coast of West Africa, and to the prospect of easier pickings. The pocket battleships were now threatening the convoy route from Freetown in Sierra Leone to the United Kingdom. But their time in warmer waters was cut short. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had sighted another escorting battleship, this time HMS Malaya. Lutyens called up U-boats to harry the convoys before running his battlecruisers into Brest. During her Atlantic foray, Scharnhorst had sunk only 8 merchantmen. In April 1941, Admiral Dernitz's U-boats had sunk 750,000 tons of merchant shipping without any assistance from the 2 battle cruisers. Within a month, the battleship Bismarck, unwisely released as a commerce raider, was hunted down by the Royal Navy. Bismarck was first disabled by an attack flown by carrier-borne Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers. Then she was pounded to destruction by heavy units of the Royal Navy's Home Fleet. Only 110 men of Bismarck's 2,000-strong crew were picked up. The fate of the Battle of the Atlantic lay in the hands of the U-boats, each one built at a fraction of the cost of a battleship or a battle cruiser. What was the point of a ship like Scharnhorst if she had to abandon her quarry at the whiff of a British battleship? Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were now bottled up in Brest, where they came under heavy attack from RAF Bomber Command. The hunters had become the hunted. But the high-level bombers found it all but impossible to deal a fatal blow to these two large stationary targets. But in July, Scharnhorst was moved to La Palisse, where she was hit by 5 bombs. She shuttled back to Brest, where she was to remain under camouflage netting for the next 6 months. In June 1941, Hitler had sent his armies east against the Soviet Union. That summer and autumn, his panzer armies drove deep into the heart of European Russia. As the German blitzkrieg threatened to tear the heart out of the Red Army, the British and later their American allies strove to make good the horrendous loss of equipment sustained by the Russians. This meant dispatching convoys around the North Cape to Murmansk and Archangel, negotiating some of the worst seas and weather conditions in the world. There were few more unforgiving environments than the one in which the War of the Arctic Convoys was fought. Early in 1942, attacks by U-boats and maritime patrol aircraft began to inflict heavy losses on the Arctic convoys. As the losses mounted, the focus of the Kriegsmarine began to shift northeast. Bismarck's sister ship, Tirpitz, was moved to Norway. The Kriegsmarine was anxious to get Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and the cruiser Prinz Eugen out of Brest so that they could follow her there. A new admiral, Otto Ciliax, was appointed to command the force. At his East Prussian headquarters, Hitler personally instructed Ciliax to get the ships back to Germany. The fate of the Bismarck meant that the Atlantic route was discounted in favor of a perilous run up the English Channel. Traffic intercepted by Bletchley Park indicated that S-boats and destroyers had been moved to Brest to escort Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and that their crews were on full alert. Air reconnaissance confirmed much naval and air activity. The airwaves held the clues, but would the British complete the puzzle? Meanwhile, the Germans were jamming British coastal radars in an operation of great subtlety. Over a period of time, the jamming frequencies had been stepped up in such small increments that British radar operators remained unaware of the increasing interference. What was soon to become known as the Channel Dash had been anticipated by the Royal Navy. But what it had not anticipated was that the breakout would be attempted in daylight, a move in the narrow waters of the Channel which the British dismissed as all but suicidal. Vice Admiral Ciliax had hoisted his flag in Scharnhorst on the 5th of February 1942. 3 days earlier, the British Admiralty and Bomber Command had agreed on a plan, codenamed Fuller, to launch a coordinated attack on the German force if it moved up the Channel. The bombers were on standby, waiting for the order to fly against Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Prinz Eugen and their escorts. But on the 10th of February, without informing the Admiralty, Bomber Command stood down more than half its force and placed the remainder, 100 bombers, on 4 hours' notice. The German force sailed from Brest on the night of the 11th of February. The code name for the operation was Cerberus. It was one of the great calculated risks of the war. A series of equipment failures in the British aircraft patrolling the warship's exit route from Brest meant that they were not spotted as they left, and by 2 in the morning they were well out into the Channel. As dawn broke, the fleet was past Cherbourg, and amazingly it was not until 10:15 that the unusual air activity over the ships was picked up by British radar. The Cerberus force had a welcome ally in the low cloud which concealed the ships from British eyes as they approached the narrow Straits of Dover, the most dangerous leg of the dash. Alerted by the radar contact, the British sent a couple of Spitfires up into the murk. They found the German fleet. But the British airmen were under strict orders to maintain radio silence. They could not report their discovery until they had landed. The British at last knew that the German fleet, hidden under the cloud and working up to 30 knots, was fast approaching the Straits of Dover. Secure in the belief that the Germans would run the channel by night, the British had been caught with their pants down. Their naval forces were dispersed, their aircraft either stood down or too far away to deliver a blow against the German fleet. Prime Minister Churchill had now been informed of the German breakout. His response was to demand that the ships must be sunk at all costs. But British delay, combined with lack of available resources, had conspired to make retribution all but impossible. The British radars were now broadcasting the German positions at 10-minute intervals, and shore batteries had opened fire ineffectually. But it was not until nearly midday that 5 motor torpedo boats were dispatched from Dover. They came within sight of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, but failed to penetrate the E-boat screen thrown around the heavy units. By 12:45, the German ships were well clear of the Dover Straits. The next attack was launched by 6 Swordfish biplanes, flying from Manston and led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, who had led the attack on Bismarck. The Swordfish, affectionately nicknamed the Stringbag, was highly maneuverable, but its low speed made it extremely vulnerable in daylight operations. Esmond's squadron had been provided with fighter escorts, but they were of little use as the lumbering Swordfish flew in low and slow through a hail of fire to make their torpedo runs. German fighters maneuvered overhead, waiting to pounce. All 6 of the Swordfish were shot down. None of them achieved a hit on the German warships. Lieutenant Commander Esmond was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. More bombers were put up in a vain attempt to halt the German progress, and 6 ships of the 21st Destroyer Flotilla were now ordered to intercept the enemy. The destroyers came under fire from Gneisenau and Prinz Eugen in the late afternoon. The dash was nearly over, but the battle cruisers were no longer unscathed. Before Scharnhorst and Gneisenau reached Wilhelmshaven and Brunsbüttel, they had both struck mines. For an anxious half an hour, Scharnhorst had been dead in the water, but no bombers found her. Operation Cerberus was home and dry. Admiral Ciliax radioed Navy Group West, "It is my duty to inform you that Operation Cerberus has been successfully completed." The Kriegsmarine had scored a brilliant tactical victory, and in the process had humiliated the Royal Navy and Bomber Command. But the elation of its seamen concealed the fact that Operation Cerberus represented an overall strategic setback from which the Kriegsmarine would never recover. Admiral Raeder was on hand to award one of Germany's highest awards, the Knight's Cross, to Ciliax and Hoffmann. Hoffmann was also promoted to Rear Admiral. But by withdrawing its surface forces to Germany, the Kriegsmarine had removed the threat they had posed while they remained on the Atlantic seaboard in northern France. Bletchley Park had received early intelligence of the mine damage to Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. RAF Bomber Command was determined to exact revenge. On the 27th of February, Gneisenau was badly damaged by a heavy air raid on Kiel, where she lay in a floating dock. she never set to sea again and ended her days as a block ship in Poland. Meanwhile, Prince Eugen had set sail for Norway. Her movements were pinpointed by Bletchley Park, enabling the submarine Trident to blow off her stern. The Kriegsmarine was forced to reassess the role of its surface fleet. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were both out of action, the latter for the duration of the war. The battleship Tirpitz was now in northern Norwegian waters, harboured at Narvik. But the pocket battleships Admiral Scheer and Lützow, the former Deutschland, could not keep pace with her as escorts. The heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper could keep up with Tirpitz, but her crew had not worked up to battle readiness. These problems were compounded by an acute shortage of fuel. The surface fleet seemed to be a blunt sword. It was left to Admiral Dönitz's U-boat arm to bear the brunt of the naval war in the Arctic. The U-boats scored their biggest success in the Arctic War in July 1942, when they mauled the ill-fated convoy PQ-17, outward bound to Murmansk. The original plan for the operation had envisaged a combination of U-boats, surface ships and aircraft. Tirpitz and Hipper were to draw off the escort, allowing Scheer and Lützow to move in for the kill. The surface ships set sail on the 1st of July, but the next day Hitler ordered them back into Altenfjord, fearful that there were aircraft carriers escorting the convoy. Once again, Bletchley Park's codebreakers were keeping abreast of developments. But the first Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, remained convinced that the German heavy units were still at sea. On the 4th of July, he ordered the convoy to scatter, 24 hours before the capital ships re-emerged from Altenfjord with the intention of attacking the convoy on the 6th. But with the convoy already scattered, the execution was done by U-boats and aircraft. Of PQ-17's 34 ships, only 11 survived. The next convoy, PQ-18, was more heavily guarded, and only 8 ships were sunk. There were no more convoys that summer, as the Allies were readying themselves for Operation Torch, the seaborne invasion of North Africa. By the time the convoys resumed in December, the Arctic U-boats had returned to the Atlantic. This left only the main units of the surface fleet as an increasingly uncertain offensive weapon against the convoys to Russia. After another abortive attack, Hitler decided to break up the big surface ships. Admiral Raeder was replaced by Admiral Dönitz, whose U-boats were causing havoc among the Allied convoys in the Atlantic. Dönitz persuaded Hitler not to take such drastic measures. The heavy units were saved from the scrapyard, and the new naval chief began to shuffle his dog-eared pack. In March 1943, Scharnhorst finally set out for Altenfjord, in Norway, to join Tirpitz and Lützow. But there were no convoys to attack, since Allied naval attention was focused on the Mediterranean, and their operations were limited to a bombardment of shore installations on Spitzbergen. This was the mighty Tirpitz's only active operation of the war. On the 23rd of September, British X-craft midget submarines badly damaged the battleship in a daring raid on Altenfjord. The stricken giant lay immobilized until March 1944. Scharnhorst was now on her own. In her new anchorage in Langfjord, life for the crew was one of unvarying routine, lightened by homely entertainments. The news read over the ship's loudspeakers omitted all mention of German defeats. Film shows broke the monotony, and fish was the staple of almost every meal. But morale remained high. When the Arctic convoys resumed, The British provided battleship escort, most frequently in the solid form of Duke of York, launched in 1940 with a main armament of 10 14-inch guns. Commander of the Royal Navy's Home Fleet was Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser. He was convinced that the lure of convoy JW-55B, which sailed from Loch Ewe on the 20th of December 1943, would bring Scharnhorst out into the open sea. On the 21st of December, Enigma intercepts indicated that Scharnhorst's battle group was at 6 hours' notice. Fraser, in the Duke of York, was sailing some way behind the convoy. He planned to destroy Scharnhorst in a night action. Ready to sail in Scharnhorst was Rear Admiral Erich Bay, a destroyer man who felt uneasy in his new command. Germany's last serviceable major unit also had a new captain, Fritz Hinze. On Christmas Eve, Fraser realized that the convoy was too far ahead of Duke of York. He broke radio silence to inform its captains to track back for 3 hours towards his covering force. The signal was heard by the Germans, but not deciphered. Had they known that the covering force was out of touch, the convoy could have been attacked with impunity. The enemy reaction was followed at Bletchley Park, where broken codes indicated that German naval intelligence only suspected that a heavy British force was following the convoy. Then, on the 26th of December, acting on further intelligence from Bletchley Park, the Admiralty issued a warning that the Scharnhorst was at sea. Fraser's trap was about to be sprung. For the crews of Scharnhorst and her escorts, Christmas celebrations for 1943 had been cut short. The German battle group set sail early in the evening of Christmas Day, with orders to attack and destroy convoy JW-55B. This convoy, bound for Kola, just south of Murmansk, and comprising 19 merchant ships, screened by a force of 10 destroyers, was the bait in the trap. Now much closer to the southwest was Admiral Fraser's covering force, consisting of the battleship Duke of York, the cruiser Jamaica, and 4 destroyers. Approaching from the east, having escorted convoy JW-55A to Murmansk, was Force 1, the cruisers Norfolk, Belfast, and Sheffield, commanded by Rear Admiral Burnett. Forging up from the south were Scharnhorst and her destroyer escorts. On the morning of the 26th, Luftwaffe patrol aircraft spotted Fraser's covering force. They reported to the German outpost on the Lofoten Islands off the Norwegian coast that they had seen 5 warships, one apparently a big one. This sighting could have been confirmed by the German wireless interception service, the Bay Dienst, which had simultaneously been eavesdropping on the traffic between Fraser and Burnett. But the commander at Lofoten forwarded to the Kriegsmarine High Command a fatally modified message which failed to mention the big ship spotted by the patrol aircraft. The High Command assumed that the sighting was of Scharnhorst's detached destroyer escort sailing home. Scharnhorst's commander, who did not receive the message of the sighting until the late afternoon of the 26th, would have known this to have been a mistake. But by then, it was too late. Scharnhorst had sailed past the point of no return. Early on Boxing Day, Admiral Bay was forging through heavy seas and swirling snowstorms in search of JW-55B. At about 7:30 in the morning, he detached his destroyer escort southwest to hunt for the convoy. Scharnhorst was now on her own. Unknown to Bay, he was on a collision course with Admiral Burnett's cruisers. At 8:40 a.m., Belfast picked up Scharnhorst on her radar. Just over half an hour later, the battle cruiser was illuminated by star shell and brought under fire. The encounter spelled disaster for Scharnhorst. As she returned fire, a shell from the cruiser Norfolk destroyed her forward radar. She was now sailing blind. The encounter had not lasted for long. After suffering the damage to her radar, Scharnhorst turned away to the south and began to work up her speed, eventually reaching 30 knots. The cruisers at first followed this move, but then turned back to cover the convoy. They could not hope to keep pace with Scharnhorst in a heavy sea, and 2 of them were temporarily afflicted with engine trouble. Moreover, Admiral Burnett had deduced, correctly as it turned out, that Scharnhorst had turned south only as a preliminary to swinging round to attack the convoy from another angle. At noon, as Scharnhorst moved northward once more towards the convoy, Burnett's radars made contact at a range of 30,000 yards. Burnett had kept himself between Scharnhorst and the convoy, and the wisdom of this move was demonstrated shortly after noon, when battle was rejoined at ranges which varied from 4 to 8 miles. In the engagement, both sides suffered damage. The cruisers scored hits on Scharnhorst, but one of the battle cruiser's shells put Norfolk's radar out of action, and another had scored a direct hit on the cruiser's after turret. But the score was still in the cruiser's favor. Without her radar, Scharnhorst was forced to fight with one hand tied behind her back. At 12:41, Bay broke off the action and steamed south at 28 knots, unknowingly towards Duke of York. On the battleship's bridge was Vivian Cox.
On the bridge of the Duke of York, from the reports from the Sheffield and the Belfast, we could judge almost exactly when we were going to make contact with the Scharnhorst. And we knew we had about an hour of awkward waiting before action was joined. And this was really the time when the Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Fraser, was simply dominating the whole ship. He wore no naval uniform as such. He just wore old trousers and a polo-necked shirt, a polo-neck sweater, and a rather battered admiral's hat. And with his pipe belching sparks and flame, he moved among us all, being extremely confident and quiet and delightful.
Admiral Fraser's hours of waiting ended at 4:17 p.m. when Duke of York established radar contact with Scharnhorst at a range of 20 miles. Half an hour later, the battlecruiser had been illuminated by star shells fired by her pursuers. Burnett's cruisers and Duke of York opened fire, the latter at a range of 12,000 yards. Scharnhorst was hit before turning away to the southeast. Then Scharnhorst began to hit back, firing broadsides as she zigzagged to confuse her enemies. As Duke of York closed in on Scharnhorst, Fraser ordered his destroyers to move in for a torpedo attack. 5 torpedoes found their mark. Remorselessly, Scharnhorst was being demolished. By 7 p.m., the range between Duke of York and Scharnhorst was closing to 8,000 yards. The British battleship was pouring broadside after broadside into the German battlecruiser. One of Scharnhorst's 3 engines was now out of action, but she was still making 22 knots. At 6:30 p.m., Captain Hinser had broadcast a brief message on the ship's tannoy. "We will make it." But Scharnhorst's body-strewn and mangled decks told another story. But Duke of York could not find a knockout blow. The range was now too short for the British battleship to send plunging fire through the armor on Scharnhorst's decks and into her vitals. Admiral Fraser was now eager to finish off the stricken giant. Duke of York stopped firing to enable Jamaica and Belfast to deliver the coup de grace. At 7:26 p.m., the cruisers moved in to launch another torpedo attack on Scharnhorst, which was now limping along at barely 12 knots. Belfast struck home from a range of 6,500 yards. Then she pulled away. Then Jamaica fired, but none of her torpedoes found their target. Once again, it was the turn of the destroyers to launch a fresh barrage of torpedoes at the smoke-shrouded Scharnhorst. The battle cruiser was now in her death throes. Captain Hintzer had sent a final message to the Führer. We shall fight to the last shell. The order was given to close the watertight doors, the preliminary to abandoning ship. Many years later, Admiral Fraser recalled the last moments of the Scharnhorst.
When we got up to her, I think within about half a mile, she was half over on her side. No, a quarter over, I might say. And she was fires about, fires all over the place. And it was really very unpleasant having to go on shooting at her because we didn't know whether she'd surrendered or what she'd done. But we had to think her, unpleasant as it was.
The end of Scharnhorst came quickly. At 7:50 p.m., Belfast moved in to follow Jamaica in another torpedo attack. But even as Belfast maneuvered, Scharnhorst decided to give up the ghost. The great ship went down by the bows and rolled to starboard. There was the sound of a colossal explosion, and then Scharnhorst was no more. Of nearly 2,000 officers and men, there were only 36 survivors. Scharnhorst had always been considered a lucky ship. Now that luck had run out. For the Royal Navy, there was jubilation. A lurking dragon had been slain. Nor was there any hiding place for the last Leviathan, Tirpitz. On the 15th of September 1944, RAF Lancasters, armed with 12,000-pound bombs, capsized and sank her in Tromsø Fjord. Brute force had destroyed Tirpitz, but the hunt for Scharnhorst had been made possible by technical experts sitting in quiet rooms far from the mountainous seas of the Arctic. The codebreakers had played a vital role in the destruction of the lucky ship, Scharnhorst.